Hey folks, TC here, and today we're going to learn how to play Scholastic's Totally Gross from University Games. Be the first player to complete a lab experiment after moving the Totally Gross slime 10 spaces, and win. To get started, players pick a playing piece and a hunk of slime. Players should roll the slime in their hands, warming the slime up until it's nice and stretchy. Players put their slime on the kids' noses on the game board. Players put their playing pieces on the lab space at the top of the game board. This is the start space. The game has 3 decks of cards. Place the professor and Totally Gross cards on the game board. Place the lab cards near the game board. These cards aren't needed until the end of the game. The youngest player will decide whether players will read the top, middle, or bottom questions on the professor cards in this game. The youngest player goes first by rolling the die and moving clockwise the number of spaces indicated. Depending on what space the player lands on, the player will either answer a question, perform a gross out, or lose a turn. Bubble spaces. When a player lands on one of these spaces, the player answers a question. The reader will pick up a professor card and read the question. Again, this will be determined by the youngest player at the beginning of the game which question will be read. After the reader asks the question, the player tries to answer it. If they answer correctly, the player gets to move their slime forward on the score line. If a player lands on a 1 space, they move 1 space. If a player lands on a 2 space, they move 2 spaces, and so on. If a player answers incorrectly, their turn is over. Totally Gross spaces. When a player lands on one of these spaces, the player performs a gross out, which is kind of like a dare. The player picks up the Totally Gross card. There are 2 options on the card. If the player's roll was odd, that player reads the top gross out to the group. If the player roll was even, the player reads the bottom gross out. The player must try and do what the card says. If they perform the gross out, the player gets to move the slime ahead 1 space on the score line. If the player doesn't try, the turn is over. Lab spaces. These spaces are either lose a turn or win the game. If a player lands on a lab space before the player has stretched the slime all the way to 10 on the score line, the player loses a turn. If a player lands on or passes a lab space after the player has already stretched their slime to 10, the player might win the game. When players stretch their slime card all the way to the number 10 on the scoreline, they are ready to perform a lab experiment. The first player to correctly complete an experiment wins the game. The reader will draw a lab card and read the experiment, or the not bold writing. After the experiment is completed, the not bold writing may be read. The player must perform the experiment and answer the question. If the player is correct, the player wins the game. If the player is wrong, the player must try and land on or pass the next lab space for another try. And that's how you play Scholastic's Totally Gross. For more information or useful tips, be sure to check out www.ugames.com so you can keep the fun going. If you found this video helpful, go ahead, give it a like. And while you're at it, make sure you've subscribed to stay up to date on the latest and greatest from University Games. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.